The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gather us in, O God. Gather us in, O God. We come tonight from many different pathways, perspectives, persuasions, positions. Gather us in, O God. Gather us in, O God, and give us the wisdom to take a moment, this one, right now, that our souls might catch up with our bodies. Gather us in, O God, gather us in and give us the grace to bring an open heart to this time of growth and learning. Save us from the certainty that crowds out discovery. Rescue us from self-righteousness. Gather us in, O God. Gather us and give us the courage to listen, to listen, to listen. Gather us in, O God, and then send us out. Because in Jesus Christ you have broken down the dividing wall of hostility. So let us live in the light of your truth. Let us live as heralds of hope. Let us live as repairers of the breach in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our city, in our nation, in the world. Gather us in, O God. Amen. In recent years, Baptist theologian and writer Russell Moore has been writing persuasively and passionately about the need for the church to repent, if we are to offer a compelling word to the world. His description in his most recent book struck me. He writes, "We are losing too many of a generation, not because they are secularists, but because they believe deep down we are." In other words, there are many today who assume that the church has sold its soul for influence, power. It's hard to blame them. Faith, captive to the quest for political power, breeds justifiable cynicism. The numbers tell the story. Last year, church membership dropped below 50% for the first time since the Gallup organization began asking that question in 1937. It was 73% that year, 1937, but what is most striking to me is that it was 70% as recently as 1999. This is a relatively new phenomenon. The reasons for this decline are as unique and diverse as the population it represents, despite the attempts to boil it down to one cause, and I have heard them all. Too conservative, too liberal, too political, too disconnected from societal issues, too deeply connected to societal issues, trying too hard, not trying hard enough, too boring, too much else going on. Any trend this widespread is complex, but there are some threads that seem to hold it together. Clearly, there is a generational divide, as younger Americans are far less likely to attend or belong to a faith community. There is a sense, either from direct experience or reputation, that churches are exclusive, judgmental. That's the leading cause among young Americans. Somehow, some way, we need to offer a courageous, Christ-centered alternative. And to do that, we need to be informed. And to be informed, we need voices like the one you will hear tonight. I first met Dr. Andrew Whitehead at a consultation on congregational life hosted by the Lilly Endowment in May of 2022. Later that summer, I reached out to Andrew to learn more about his research and work. It was a fortuitous and timely conversation. In fact, the conversation was so timely that Andrew had to delay our initial lunch date when he was invited instead to serve as a panelist on a Meet the Press Reports special on the rise of Christian nationalism. I told him it was okay to cancel lunch for Meet the Press. Andrew Whitehead is a leading scholar, a researcher, and an author on this topic. His most recent book, you see it around the room this evening, American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church, is a powerful and essential contribution to our understanding of this topic and how we, as people of faith, are called to confront this betrayal with grace, with compassion, and with clarity in our convictions. Grace and compassion are words that must be spoken in any introduction of Andrew Whitehead. He is a person whose own faith compels him to speak truth, and whose faith compels him to do this in love. I have witnessed this firsthand, and I have been inspired by it. It is no surprise that Andrew was selected last year in the same academic year for both a Trailblazing Researcher Award and IUPUI's Outstanding Faculty Teaching Award. For Andrew, teaching and research go hand in hand. He combines first-rate research with a teacher's heart. And so we are fortunate to have him here. And I am blessed to call him my friend. Welcome, Andrew Whitehead, to Second Presbyterian Church.
Thank you. That's really kind. Appreciate it. Well, good evening. Good to be with you all. I always like to pause a little bit and just take in how grateful I am that we can be together. The pandemic wasn't that long ago when none of this could really happen, and it really is a gift for me to be with you this evening. I know for you to be with each other. Grateful for this congregation, the leadership and team here. I was joking with David just a second ago. Maybe this is a job talk of sorts for a sociologist in residence. So we'll see how it goes, but just let Chris know, if you want that on staff. Well, I'd like to start a little bit with where I came from. And for those that have interacted with the book, you know some of this story, part of this journey. And I can't see the screens, but did it move? Okay, perfect. So I grew up in northern Indiana, a really small town. Wakarusa. Anybody heard of that town before? Okay, home of the world's largest jelly beans that you can buy at the Maple Syrup Festival. And according to tradition, Wakarusa means knee-deep in mud in Native American language there, but nobody can actually verify that. So I think that's just what was told to us growing up. The town's population, like a lot of small towns in Indiana, has hovered between 1,000 and 2,000 people for the last 80 years. Manufacturing is big in this town. And, I remember in late March growing up, the Maple Syrup Festival was one of our big deals. Chicago Bears legend Gale Sayers, any Bears fans? Okay, so he actually had a home in Wakarusa, and I would see him at church some Sundays during the year. But he would have, at the Maple Syrup Festival, where young kids could come, and if they could throw a football through the tire 3 in a row, they would get an autographed copy of a picture of him playing. Sadly, I never achieved that feat, but I'm totally over it. I've moved on. But growing up in this town, for those of us that have grown up in similar towns in Indiana or, in the United States, there's a certain feel, right? And as I describe it, maybe some of those feelings come back to you. Only one stoplight. You can kind of see it in this picture there. There's a blinking one, a couple blocks away. And you actually see the eastern wall of the church that I grew up in this picture, down by the bus. If you can find the bus, that brick wall, it's the Wakarusa Missionary Church. And there are no shortage of churches in my town. If I map it out right now, in a 5-mile radius, there's over a dozen congregations serving that area. And for those maybe closer, because none of the flags are waving, you see them just hanging limply, but there are no less than 4 American flags in this picture, too. And I learned so much growing up in this town. I learned what it meant to be a neighbor, what it meant to care for others, community, families, faith, American pride. These were all a part of the day in, day out, year in, year out culture of this town. People cared for each other, and we lived and worshiped alongside, right, the people that were our electricians or our florists, our teachers. So Sunday morning, Wednesday night, Sunday night, right, we were all together. And it was unspoken, but kind of acknowledged that being a good American meant you were a Christian, and that was a part of it. And in some ways, being Christian, then you're a good American, you're a good Christian. These things went together. So for us to care for those around you, to accept the correct beliefs, stand up for what is right, advocate for Christian convictions in the public square, all of these were a part of what it meant to do well as a Christian, as American. But looking back at this history, and as I left Wakarusa and grew older, I could identify a couple moments where that taken for grantedness of that view, there were little holes that started to get punched in the veil, little cracks that started to appear. So I attended a white evangelical megachurch growing up, and I was very active. So just like tonight, Wednesday night, I was there. Sunday night, Sunday morning, I was there. When the church doors were open, I was going to walk through them. Played bass in the church band. I don't know if I played it very well, but loved to do that. And on a summer youth group trip, staying on the banks of Lake Erie, one of my youth pastors at the time, kind of offhand, offered me a question. And it was asking me to consider whether or not Christians could fight for their country in a war and possibly kill other people and other Christians on the other side. So suddenly, for me at that age, my categories of us versus them were no longer so neat and defined. Another moment came through the music I listened to in high school. So one of the bands that I enjoyed and loved, the first song on their first CD talked about and decried the slaughter of Native American peoples in our country's history under the banner of Manifest Destiny and pointing out how this was anti-Christian. So that was very different from a lot of the mainstream Christian acts that others were listening to or that I was listening to as well at that time. But here again, it caused me to stop and think about my country, its history, and how this intersected with my Christian identity. Then as a freshman at Purdue University, I took a U.S. history course from the colonies up to Reconstruction. And my professor was Dr. Frank Lambert. So one neat little tidbit about him, he was actually a punter for the Steelers in the 60s. I don't know if anybody is a Steelers fan or could remember Frank Lambert punting for them. But he did that and then went to grad school and became a leading thinker on the founding period in religion and the religion of the founding fathers. But during class one day, he remarked how the founding fathers, while some of them were religious, but definitely not all, they certainly weren't evangelical Protestant as we understand that term today and what that means today. And growing up in that religious tradition, that was another door opening for me. And the final moment was in graduate school. It was at that point that I read a book by Greg Boyd called The Myth of a Christian Nation. And so this journey began to kind of coalesce at this moment for me, where he argued that the kingdom of God and the kingdom of this world, or kingdoms of this world, operate according to different principles, right? Power over others versus power under others, or power through service and sacrifice. And here again, it caused me to think deeply about what it meant to be a Christian in the public sphere, right? Whether that's politics, but certainly not ending there, but just in the civil space. Now, at this time, too, in graduate school, I began to learn my craft, sociology. And a powerful concept within the sociology of religion is plausibility structures. So plausibility structures are the social arrangements that provide support for meaning in belief systems. So you can imagine yourself at the center of a broad web where everybody you know is situated around you. Folks you know better, closer to you, others further away, acquaintances, and then people maybe you barely know or who are very distant from you further out. And you're connected to all these folks, friends, family, whoever else, by connective tissue. Those you know really well, who are close to you, it's a thick connective strand. Others further away, it gets thinner and thinner. So if you can think of it in that sense, right? If everybody in your plausibility structure, all these strands connecting you to these different people, if everyone on the ends of those strands sees the world in the same way that you do, values the same things, believes the same things, right? Your web is strong. Your plausibility structure is strong, right? It provides support for those meaning and belief systems that you hold dear. So if you have a strong plausibility structure, you're never really going to have to deeply evaluate the beliefs and values that you hold because everyone else reflects those back to you. They just are. They're taken for granted. And to the extent that those values and beliefs are taken for granted, they're most powerful because they're unseen. They just are. Similar to fish not knowing the water that they're swimming in, right? It's just around them. Now imagine at the end of some of those connective strands, folks maybe have different values or certain beliefs different than you. Your web is no longer quite as strong. Some of those beliefs and values now are no longer taken for granted. You have to evaluate them. So the degree that your web is weakened depends on how close those folks are to you, how thick of a connective strand that connects you to them is, right? So somebody further away that has a different value or belief, it probably won't cause you to reevaluate too deeply what you hold dear or what you think about the world. But if it is someone close to you with a thick connective strand, then you're forced to deeply evaluate what you hold dear. You're going to be forced to reconsider some of those beliefs. Now, I grew up, right, in Wakarusa, the Wakarusa Missionary Church, Napanee Missionary Church, in the midst of a strong plausibility structure, right? Everyone around us saw the world in the same way, believed the same things, valued the same things. But what I later came to realize, right, as some of those connective strands changed for me, I was forced to reevaluate some of those beliefs and values. And what I later came to study and name as Christian nationalism was, for many, and still is, taken for granted, right? It is the way that the world is. There is no deep questioning of it, usually. I didn't question the tenets of Christian nationalism, and more importantly, I didn't question how those tenets differed from other expressions of the Christian faith. For me, it was the Christian faith. This is the way that it worked. So those moments that I shared and different people that I've come across with began to rewire my plausibility structures. So the social arrangements that provided support for those meaning and belief systems started to shift. Now, in graduate school, I began to start analyzing large surveys of the American public to understand how people believe and what they believe and how that influences what they do in their social worlds. And an early survey that we used in Baylor University in Texas. Any fans? Okay, a couple. Yeah. So that's where I went to grad school. But they had a survey, and one of the early surveys asked questions of the American public of how they viewed the relationship between Christianity and the public sphere, right? How closely intertwined should those be? So a good friend of mine and colleague, Sam Perry, who I wrote the first book with, we began to explore how these questions could help signal, again, how people thought about how religion and Christianity should interact. And we looked at how they associated with different questions like interracial marriage or transracial adoption, same-sex marriage, or gender roles. And what we found over time really astounded us, that some of the strongest predictors of Americans' attitudes across these very different topics were above and beyond due to their views of how closely intertwined Christianity and American identity should be intertwined. So above and beyond their political party, above and beyond their personal religious practice or beliefs. The degree to which they thought that Christianity should be privileged in the public sphere told us a lot about their views on social life. So after several articles were published, we wrote our first book, Taking America Back for God. And in it, we provide the first empirically supported definition of Christian nationalism, which I'll share in just a bit. But we also lay out all the evidence that we found about what Christian nationalism does and what it's so strongly associated with. So I want to read through just some of those to you, because again, this is part of my personal journey with this. So we found Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism were more likely to support a candidate for president who did not personally adhere to many basic beliefs and values of the Christian faith that I was taught growing up, in his words or his actions. They were more likely to believe that refugees in the Middle East pose a terrorist threat, more likely to deny free speech to religious minorities who they deem as a threat to the United States, more likely to oppose abortion no matter the situation, even the result of rape. We're more likely to believe immigrants threatened American culture, increased crime, and were mostly dangerous criminals. They were more likely to be not at all comfortable with their hypothetical daughter marrying someone who is black, more likely to believe that police treat black Americans the same as white Americans, more likely to believe that black Americans suffer under the hands of violence against the police because they're more inherently violent than white Americans, more likely to believe that Muslims, Jews, and atheists hold morally inferior values, threaten their personal freedoms, and endanger their physical safety, more likely to believe that women should care for children in the home and leave the corporate and political worlds to men. So as I started to look at this evidence stacking up, I became more and more convinced of the detrimental influence that Christian nationalism has, not only on democracy, how we treat and work alongside each other in America, but that it was detrimental to the church. It contradicted some of those core beliefs and values that I was taught growing up. To love your neighbor, to love the Lord your God, to care for those less fortunate. And as Chris talked about and prayed earlier, to breaking down the dividing walls of hostility. So in short, it became clear to me that Christian nationalism makes American Christians less Christ-like. The quest for power inherent in Christian nationalism, as I'll share in a little bit, I found to be antithetical to Jesus' message that I was taught growing up. But what I also realized is that many of the same folks who raised me to love Jesus and his message also embraced Christian nationalism. So they saw little to no difference between the two. They were taken for granted. It's one and the same. And I've had close family members ask me, after writing the first book, whether I was indeed still a Christian because of what I said about Christian nationalism, just to highlight the overlap of the two. So it's this realization that led me to write, through some prompting from others, American Idolatry, in order to lay out how Christian nationalism betrays the gospel and threatens the church. So based on our empirical research over almost a decade now, we define Christian nationalism as social scientists as a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates for a particular expression of Christianity to be privileged in the public sphere. And this particular expression of Christianity is conservative and ethnocentric in many ways. So it holds that this version of Christianity should be held up and vigorously preserved by the government as the organizing framework of the United States. Now, beyond any theological or religious beliefs associated with Christianity, Christian nationalism as a cultural framework brings with it a number of different elements above and beyond what we might identify as the historic beliefs of Christianity. So it isn't just about saying that Jesus is the Son of God or that Jesus came to earth to save sinners or whatever else. But there are other elements that come along with it, cultural baggage, as I like to describe it. So one is a strong sense and a strong moral traditionalism based on creating and sustaining social hierarchies. So it has a clear view of who is at the top of society, who is in the middle, and who is at the bottom. These often revolve around gender and sexuality. It has a comfort with authoritarian social control. So it views the world as a chaotic place. And because of that, at times, society needs strong rules and strong rulers to come in and enforce that moral order that it holds dear, under the threat of violence or through the use of violence, right, to enact this order. It has a desire for strict boundaries around national identity, civic participation, and even social belonging. Who gets to call themselves an American? Who gets to be a part of this group? And these generally fall along ethno-racial lines. So a Christian nation, quote unquote, as it's understood, is one where it's imagined that the ideal, typical American is white and natural-born citizen, with everyone else coming after. And it also includes a populist impulse that inclines Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism towards feelings of victimization and always being under attack or persecuted, which leads to conspiratorial thinking and suspicion towards various elites, whether it's religious leaders, academics, political leaders, all of those. So the question, after we define Christian nationalism, usually rises of, well, how many Americans embrace Christian nationalism? What does this look like? So I'll share just a little bit, because I wouldn't be a good quantitative sociologist and social scientist if I didn't have a figure or two for you. And so for those that have been waiting for this moment, here we go. All right. So when we're looking at all Americans, these are just several key facts of what you should know when we're talking about the size of this group. Just under half of all Americans embrace Christian nationalism to some extent. Now, for some, it's a very loose embrace. We would barely call them sympathetic, right? But they are on that side of at least sympathizing with it. Those that strongly embrace Christian nationalism are the smallest group. We call them ambassadors. I believe they're the red bar here. Yeah. So this is around 16% using this data that I'm showing here. Now, around a third, the largest group, identify as accommodators. So these folks are more or less open to this idea of this expression of Christianity being privileged in the public sphere, but they're not comprehensive in their support. So these are the folks that may not necessarily be the ones pushing to put "In God We Trust" in all the schools, right? But they would stay silent when ambassadors are those that are putting forth that type of legislation. Then we have resistors of Christian nationalism, that's around a quarter of the population. Rejectors, around a quarter of the population. So when we're talking about Christian nationalism, it isn't growing like wildfire, although journalists that call me would like me to say that. It's actually shrinking. Ambassadors are getting smaller over time. And again, they are the smallest group. They're the ones that are smallest. Now, in the question and answer time, we could talk more about the implications of that, which are really interesting. But what I'd like to show, too, is not just where Christian nationalism ranks among all Americans, but let's look at Christian traditions, specifically white Christian traditions. So here we have the findings for white mainline Protestant groups, like the PCUSA, white evangelical Protestants, and white Catholics. So Christian nationalism, if we look at its history, was created, sustained within white Christian traditions. Right? And we see that history and the repercussions of it here, where because it's primarily located within white Christian traditions, it's important for those of us in those traditions to take seriously what this is and reckon with it in this current context. But we see that slightly more white mainline Protestants embrace Christian nationalism to some extent compared to the total population. White evangelicals are the group that most strongly embraces it. But you can compare those groups with all Americans there. So the narratives, values, beliefs, and symbols that are wrapped up in this cultural framework of Christian nationalism were cultivated within white Christian traditions, seminaries, denominations, congregations. So not only should we understand the breadth, right, of how many Americans embrace Christian nationalism, but then what does it mean? What are the implications of this? And it's something that I explore in both books, and I want to share a little bit of even across religious traditions how powerful this cultural framework is. So there's evidence that I'm going to show you in just a little bit of three figures that highlight how folks who embrace Christian nationalism, no matter their religious tradition, whether they're mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, or Catholic, or none and unaffiliated, if they embrace Christian nationalism, they look more similar to each other than they do to people within their own religious tradition who might resist or reject Christian nationalism. So we're going to look at 3 figures, and you'll see the pattern play out almost identically with different topics. So let's look at the first figure. So in this figure, we're looking at the percent of Americans who agree that discrimination against white Americans is as big a problem as discrimination against black Americans and other minorities. Okay? So you can look at the similar breakdown, right? Whether we're looking at evangelical, mainline, Catholic, or the unaffiliated, ambassadors, those who strongly embrace Christian nationalism, are more likely to agree that whites are equally discriminated against as blacks in America, if they're mainline Protestant, Catholic, or unaffiliated. Next, we can look at those that agree, there we go, that allowing a small business owner in their state to refuse to provide products or services to gay or lesbian people should be allowed. So again, in this measure, we can see that across religious traditions, if folks are ambassadors or even accommodators that strongly embrace Christian nationalism or are sympathetic to it, they're more likely to agree with this statement that folks should be allowed to refuse service or products to gay or lesbian people. So the pattern here is the same. And what it's showing us is that Christian nationalism unites folks across religious traditions or even outside of Christianity with this political purpose. Now, finally, looking at attitudes towards immigrants. So this is the number of Americans who agree, percentage that agree, that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. Right? So an ethnocentrism here. So yet again, we see that those that strongly embrace Christian nationalism are more likely to agree with this statement. So if you're mainline and you reject Christian nationalism, around 8% agree with this statement. But if you're an ambassador and you're a mainline Protestant, about 74% embrace or agree with this topic and this attitude. So here again, Christian nationalism can unite across religious traditions how people think about this. Now, how is it doing this? What does it mean? So I think, yet again, when we look at this data, for us Christians, white Protestants, white mainline Protestants, we need to underscore how Christian nationalism is not just a problem out there, but it is something in here, right, among us that we have to reckon with, have to take ownership of, educate ourselves, which I think you're doing, resource ourselves and our leaders. Because no matter where we worship, embracing this cultural framework has very similar outcomes overall, outcomes that I think draw us away from, again, loving our neighbor. So how do we do that? Well, one way I think to keep the focus on Christian nationalism and not trying to identify if somebody is a Christian nationalist, right? It doesn't help to label a person in any way. And what we find is that Christian nationalism isn't an either-or proposition. It is a spectrum that folks can embrace it more or less. And so focusing on Christian nationalism helps us to identify the mechanisms that operate within it. These are what I call the idols of Christian nationalism. And the first of these is power. So I write how, in American Idolatry, how idols are anything that we put our trust in above and beyond God. So they make promises of protection and provision, but they require allegiance from us. Idols co-opt our theological imaginations, and they distort our visions of who God is, and they distort our visions of who our neighbor is and what we should do for our neighbor. So Christian nationalism focuses on gaining and maintaining access to power. I think power is the central idol of Christian nationalism. And power is the ability to get others to do what you want despite their resistance. Now, in particular, I'm focused on self-interested power, right? So this is power that primarily serves us, quote unquote, the in-group, right? And how we define that, we want to use that power to benefit ourselves. So a thirst for self-interested power, I think, is central to Christian nationalism. James Cone, a theologian, writes, "Self-interest and power corrupted there," and he's talking about white Christians, "understanding of the Christian gospel." So idolizing self-interested power allowed Christians throughout our history and even today to baptize the pursuit of privilege that primarily benefits them, requires little self-sacrifice, and allows them and helps them to ignore the inequalities that are around them. Now, when you have access to self-interested power, you're always going to be afraid to lose it. So fear is that second idol of Christian nationalism, and it's one of the primary tools used to motivate action. Now, this isn't just applied to Christian nationalism. As we look at any group, fear is a very powerful political motivator, right? So this is something that operates in how groups operate. But generally, fear is used to distinguish between us and them, right? Fear helps draw these very strong boundaries around who we are and who they are, those committed to a Christian nation and those who are not. So fear and a sense of threat are central to creating a strong feeling of an in-group, right? Who we are. Because the quickest way and best way to know who we are is to know who we're not. So if we can identify who we're not, that helps again draw those boundary lines around who we are. Now, history and social science show over and over that stoking a sense of fear and threat in the in-group aimed at outgroups, whether it's religious or racial outgroups or others, is central to defending and maintaining this cultural framework of Christian nationalism. I have a friend, a political scientist, who talks about the inverted golden rule. And when we idolize fear, we embrace this inverted golden rule to do unto others as we think they'll do unto us. So Christians who fear that their cultural and political power will be taken from them, that other groups will be in positions of privilege, because again, that's all we've ever known, we fear the treatment that they might visit upon us, or that we're told they'll visit upon us. Now, when we idolize power and fear, violence is the natural response. And this is the last idol of Christian nationalism. Because violence can be used to demarcate those boundaries between us and them. We succumb to fear that something is being taken from us, and we'll do anything we can to keep that from happening. We have a fear that we'll never recover. So violence in the service of perceived, actual threats always revolve around protecting power. So the tragic history of indigenous populations in the United States and other minorities clearly demonstrates that any quest to protect power based on a hierarchical relationship between us and them will ultimately, and if that's ultimately founded on fear of those other groups, will resort to violence. So in the book, I explore how these three items in more depth confront, and how pointing out how confronting these idols is central for us confronting Christian nationalism. So we have to disciple ourselves to identify when we're moving towards those different idols: self-interested power, fear, and violence. And when we do that, we can then start to explore expressions of Christianity that oppose those idols and move us towards expressions of God's kingdom. So in this sense, we don't even have to explicitly name Christian nationalism in our congregations. What we should do, though, rather, is help those around us move towards expressions of Christ-like responses to power, fear, and violence. And after doing that, hopefully they'll be able to recognize when they're being pushed in those directions, whether it's from other religious leaders or political leaders. And doing that, hopefully, too, will help us reject Christian nationalism in our midst and recognize when those idols are being fomented. And most importantly, we'll begin to rewire and revise our plausibility structures. Those of us will be able to serve as trusted others to those that may be wrestling with these issues, to raise those questions. So as I look back over my own journey, as I built and maintained relationships with others, folks who believed and saw the world differently than I did, there came a point where I could no longer not reevaluate those things that I took for granted. The traditions, narratives, and symbols that were central to Christian nationalism. Now, ultimately, I could have come to the decision to hold on to those, right? To not move away. But against the weight of evidence, both from what stories that were being told to me from those that were on the margins, to the social scientific evidence, I couldn't maintain those values. So those of us who have decided to confront and oppose Christian nationalism will have to kindly but firmly serve as those trusted others, those people in the plausibility structures of our neighbors, family members, friends, giving them opportunity to question some of those deeply held beliefs. And I think, too, it isn't as though we need to tell them, this is what you should think, but merely give the opportunity and raise the questions that open up space for them to first see how others might see this world differently. Now, the second, which is related, but perhaps even more important aspect that we need to do to confront and oppose, beyond serving as connections in people's plausibility structures, is to think carefully about how our organizations function and how we use resources and to what end. So to confront and oppose white Christian nationalism, we need to recognize it isn't just a person-to-person heart problem, although that is a part of it. But we also need to recognize that it's interwoven in how our systems operate, whether it's Second Presbyterian or other denominations. So we'll need to proactively push resources and decision-making power in different directions. So this is how we can begin to imagine, as tonight's talk was titled, rebuild the relationship between faith and politics. Because we have to realize that politics is about power. So it isn't as though Christians shouldn't wield power, but we have to think deeply about to what ends and to whose benefit, right? And as I'll share in a little bit, that's a key part of, again, confronting and opposing Christian nationalism. So we can make numerous changes to what is preached, to where we spend money, where we go for theological training, what books we assign or quote or stock in the congregational bookstore. Because a key insight from the field of sociology is that changes to systems don't just happen by changing individual hearts and minds. Everyone could see the world differently, but if the system was built on those underlying beliefs, it will continue to operate, whether anybody on the ground believes those values anymore. So we'll have to continue to think through how those pervading myths and symbols and narratives pervade how our organizations function as well. So the reality and necessity of collective and systemic responses extends to how we engage politically at the local, state, and national level. So I share a story of a good friend of mine in the book, and she wisely points out that no friendship is apolitical. When we're truly friends and neighbors with someone different than us, it's going to place us on a particular side politically. So in the United States, where we know that there is a history of marginalizing certain groups, to be neighbors with them and friends with them is going to place us on a particular side. Doesn't always mean one side or the other, but we have to recognize that to be with those folks who are being marginalized means that we're going to also experience how those systems function as they do. So this may be what it means to rebuild the relationship between faith and politics, recognizing that our faith encourages us to locate ourselves among the marginalized, and then to listen, explore, and discover how we can leverage what we've been given to benefit them. And that all people should have access to a world of flourishing. So we'll have to begin to ask ourselves if we're content to be carried along by the same historical trends and currents, or if we'll push back and begin to move against the current. So in the dozens of studies that I've been a part of or others have conducted in recent years, we find repeatedly that the practical fruit of Christian nationalism is not love. It's domination, fear, violence, control, power. So when Jesus came, he preached a kingdom of God and a gospel that was good news to the oppressed, good news to the poor, good news to the imprisoned. And he wasn't just talking about our personal salvation, as if we could just spiritualize all of those categories. But he was talking about abundant life for all these groups that were marginalized. So I've come to believe that once we see the gospel as actual good news for the present, good news for the marginalized, good news for the prisoner, good news for the poor, good news for the blind, and good news for the oppressed, We can begin to take the evidence that sociology and social science hands us about Christian nationalism and recognize how this ideology limits and in many cases outright opposes the work that Jesus claimed he came to do and commanded us to do likewise. Love the Lord your God, to love your neighbor as yourself. And not to consistently seek to justify ourselves by asking, well, who is my neighbor? We can embrace a gospel of Jesus that realigns the power structures of society that we know are crushing people on the margins. We can disrupt those systems of oppression that maintain racial injustice and their destructive effects on human relationships. We can embrace a gospel that Jesus came to bring that we all might have life abundant, that we can rebuild the relationship again between religion, faith, and politics through a gospel that's focused on the flourishing of all and not just on some. That we can rectify and be a part of rectifying destructive social systems. So that when we pray, Lord, let your kingdom come, we can take Jesus' prayer seriously and participate in the ongoing work reflecting God's kingdom here on earth. And remember that he prayed that it would come today, not just in the future, but that we can be a part of that work and ongoing work today. Thank you so much. And I look forward to discussing more with you. So I think we'll have question and answer, and they've got 2 mics, and they asked that we would speak into the mic so everybody can hear.
So we're going to have a time. We've got about 30-ish minutes for Andrew to interact with you. Let me just say this by way of introduction to this period. I know because I've been around the church and we've had folks reading the book that this topic raises the temperature in the room sometimes, and that's okay. Yep. I know Andrew welcomes any comments, challenges, but we will do it respectfully. So with that, raise your hand, and David's working that side of the room. I've got this side of the room, and we'll kind of go back and forth. So wait till we give you the mic, and then ask your question.
Reverend Whitehead, I absolutely agree with everything that you've said, and to hear it was really, really inspirational for me. I happen to be a secular Jew, and as I look back over the centuries, it would seem this is not, Christian nationalism as you define it, is not a new aspect of Christianity, but Christianity on and off for centuries has been operating on the principle of confirming its power, making others fear them, and not infrequently, unfortunately, resorting rather to violence to suppress those who refuse to follow Jesus and Christianity. And I think this has been going on for centuries, and I don't know if it's worse now or it was worse historically, and I'd just like your views on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one aspect or I think a couple ways that I would respond to that. One thing we have to realize, like you said, is that it's been around for a very long time. We could go all the way back to the first time that Christianity had a sense and a taste of political power when Constantine, right, married that with Roman rule. And so then was the first time that it really had access to the halls of power. And since then, any time that it was within reach of that, I think in many ways we could see where it pushed folks away from an expression of Christianity. Perhaps that is more about flourishing rather than power and control. But I also think, like you said, that it isn't anything unique about Christianity. And I want to make that clear. Any world religion married with political power and enjoying majority rule for a number of years can fall into a religious nationalism just like we see here. And so it isn't as though I'm attacking, and not that you're saying I'm saying that, but others have said, right, that I'm attacking Christianity, and that isn't true. When we look at different countries, there are other world religions that get involved and get married with political power, and we have Hindu nationalism or, in majority Muslim nations, you're going to see religious nationalism as well. And it isn't as though the United States is unique. Like, as you said, over history, since Christianity has been a part of the world religions, there have been other nations where it's been married to political power. But I think here in the U.S., it's our unique experience and our job then to confront it. And so I don't think that it is any stronger now. There is some evidence in some of the studies we work on that it waxes and wanes, and it responds to historical moments. I think that we're living in a moment that it is associated with a person with a lot of political power that gave it, the rhetoric really pushed it into the public sphere more than we have before, in some sense. But we see it going back not only decades but centuries, even in the United States and before the U.S. was formed. So I think that historical view is so important to recognize what we've been handed, right? And then, too, to take the pressure off. It isn't as though this is something new, but it's something we have to continually wrestle with. And so, I appreciate your comments and that and encouragement to look at it historically. Yeah.
Somebody on that side of the room, anyone? I've got another taker over here. Hold on.
Have you written any books?
I have. Yeah, I've written 2 books about this. Thank you.
Go ahead, Sam.
You began by talking about the decline of young people connection to religion. Do you see any connection between that and what you call Christian nationalism? Isn't it true that most young people would prefer to have something that they can adhere to, something they can believe, something authoritative, if you want to use that word? And the lack of authoritativeness is what's driving them away?
That's a good question. I mean, when we're looking at why younger folks are more likely to be unaffiliated, and there's a distinct connection between age and affiliation with religious traditions overall, there's a lot of mechanisms that work there. And so whether or not it's seeking authority or questioning authority, that is a part of some of what sociologists find of why folks are moving in the unaffiliated direction. But then also, as there are more people disaffiliating, they're having children and raising them in homes that are unaffiliated, and so demographics is a part of that as well. So it's a very convoluted story. But some of that backlash and disaffiliation is due to Christian nationalism and the wedding of religion and politics.
Thanks. Thanks again for this awesome presentation. I think being informed like this is, I find very uplifting. So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about the challenges of this tough love, because that's what we're about, is inclusivity and trying to build bridges. I often feel like I'm in the margins sitting, in a beautiful church like this. Sometimes I think we may have it backwards, and we should be there more. But how can you give us some more examples of how to build the bridges? How do you engage in conversations that may be very uncomfortable? Chris always talks about, of course, as Christ said, love your neighbor, but so easy to say, but very difficult to do. And if it's your neighbor, that's your enemy, really, in some ways. How do you incorporate that love? I always say, Mr. Rogers said, understanding love is the hardest thing in the world, and it's many, many forms. Yeah. And if you could help maybe give a few examples of how to bridge that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that I'm still on a journey myself, right? And trying to figure out how to listen to more diverse voices and experiences, because I've only lived my life, and I only really understand kind of the road that I've walked. But in listening and reading to other voices and the experiences that they've had, that's what has changed me and helped me to see where I might have had blinders on, where I've been blinded to their experiences and how they might interact with, whether it's political systems or schools or universities or religious traditions. And so an easy way to start is the people that we read. And so reading books by authors that differ from us in one way or another, I think helps us to see those stories. And then as we look around in our communities, where folks are or what they're doing that might have different experiences. And then too, recognizing that the folks that we interact with, they might be one person and we can help that one person, but then to see them as part of a group and a community. And there's going to be others that are experiencing those same things. And so if we can then start to work to support that community, we can change the experiences for more of them. Similar to, like in the book, talking about plucking one person out of the river, we can start to look upstream and what's causing more of them to fall in. So can we work at that? And so I think the voices we listen to, the people we interact with, that's one place to start. And then doing it together, I think, helps, right? To know that we're not alone. We're on the journey with others that are hoping and trying to rebuild, right, as you all are talking about here. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, a comment and a question. First, I felt like you had been in the room with Corey and I on conversations about kind of looking at the people who introduced us to Christianity and our faith and feeling that tension of, I feel like I'm implementing the values you taught me, and we're disagreeing. So I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people my age, almost verbatim what you said. So that was really interesting to hear from a research perspective. And my question is, you shared that reporters want to hear that people who adhere to Christian nationalism is growing like wildfire, but in fact it's shrinking, and that there are some implications for the fact that they are the smallest group. And I wondered if you could share some of those implications.
Yeah, definitely. When we find over the last decade now, about 15 years, that group that strongly embraces it is growing smaller. Now, we have to keep into account that the group that does embrace it, if we look at them as part of the voting population, they actually are a bigger percentage. And so in certain places, it can be important. So it isn't as though the shrinking means they're unimportant. Still matters. But what we find, too, is that as groups get smaller, the identities that place them and make them different from those around them become more salient. And so as ambassadors are shrinking as the size of the population, the fact that they're ambassadors makes them different from others becomes even more important to how they define themselves to those around them. And so in this sense, the group might be smaller, but Christian nationalism becomes a greater part of how they see and understand themselves as kind of a remnant that is protecting or returning the United States, right, to this Christian nation as it should be. And so in that sense, it's kind of, it's growing smaller, but in importance, that is why we're hearing more about it. These folks might see themselves as, again, identified as this remnant. And so those are the implications as we see them right now. But yeah, thank you for that.
Hi.
Hi.
So when you were talking about the idols of Christian nationalism, that was really helpful. Just thinking about how those have played out in the KKK and institutionalized slavery and all those things, and even back, working all the way back even to the Crusades and all those things. Do you think that there are any guardrails or things that we can institutionalize and systemize within the church to kind of stop our participation in those?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. And I think the word you use, guardrails, is really helpful. So there can be kind of two ways we think about it. One is looking just at democracy and living in a pluralistic democratic society. So there's a book called How Democracies Die, and they use that term, guardrails. There are different guardrails to democracy. That one is recognizing that your political opponents are not only human, but have a right to exist. And some of those things get attacked, and that's just one example. But as those guardrails get attacked, then it becomes closer to where we slide away from democracy into something else. And so living in a world and in a nation that, at least purports, to really uphold religious diversity and religious freedom, I think those are things that we can value and try to protect and defend as Christians, to defend the right of others who are different from us to exist and be a part of this community, right? Because someday we might be a minority. right? And so to think through, well, how would we want to be treated as a religious minority, and then treat others in that way, defending a true religious freedom and liberty in the sense that they have the right to exist and have a seat at the table and to not center ourselves. So I think some of that works together, right, to defend a culture and a society and a civic sphere where others have the right to be there and that we're going to work with them and listen to them. And that's difficult, and it can be messy, and compromise is hard. But I think the alternative creates more harm. And so as Christians, I think that's something to think about and to work towards too. But I think the guardrails are really important, and those are a couple examples that I can think of. But thank you.
Looking at the idols of the three idols you mentioned in terms of power, fear, and violence, and looking at those from an individual Christian perspective versus a larger group perspective, is there a hierarchical order?
Oh, to the idols. You know, I think power is central in that aspect. I think fear and violence work alongside that. And there might be other idols too. These are the three that I focus on. But I think that desire for self-interested power is central. And I think that drives a lot of what we see with Christian nationalism.
I haven't read your book yet, but I'm wondering if you equate nationalism and patriotism.
I do talk about that, and the difference I think that we can draw between the two, to where patriotism and love of our fellow country, women and men, isn't something that Christians have to set aside. They can be patriots and want the best for those around us, and that others can have access to all of the good things that we have access to, right? The historical accident of being born American isn't something that I chose, but I benefit from. But then wanting to see others have that benefit as well. And I think that is patriotism. I think looking at the difficult parts of our history and not shying away from that is love of country. Because when we love somebody, we tell them the truth, and they tell us the truth, and we work through that, and it can be difficult. So I think those are signs of patriotism that I want to see. Whereas with nationalism, it's trying to set one group above and beyond and over others to their detriment so that we have more. I think that's how we can understand that. So I think they are separate, and Christians can be faithful and patriotic in the sense of wanting to see the flourishing of our fellow countrymen and women and the blessings of this nation being spread as far and as wide as possible. Thank you.
The German philosopher from the last century, Hans-Jörg Gadamer, spoke a lot, and I'd like you to comment kind of on his the concept of the limits of our sight from our worldview, the horizon, he calls it. And when we come into contact with others, how we can come to a larger worldview, the fusion of horizons. Would you talk about how you might think that could be helpful in some of our obstacles we have here?
Yeah, definitely. Another way I've heard this described is your map is not the territory. So we're handed a map, and it tells us a lot, but in many ways, it's always going to be incomplete. It doesn't describe everything. And so the more that we can compare maps or compare stories or hear those different horizons and views, I think is ultimately helpful. And it can be difficult and uncomfortable, but ultimately helpful. And so, yeah, I don't know the person that you cite. I haven't read his work. I'll just say that outright. But
that's my territory.
Yeah, I'll let John handle that.
No.
He can chime in.
This is his night.
Yeah. That's a wonderful question, though. Thank you.
I just had a comment. I was very taken with your book. Thank you. What I took away was a little reference even to what Chris said about deliver us from our self-righteousness. It really was I don't want to say condemning, because I know that's not who God would want us, how we are to take away and feel that bad about ourselves. But I feel it's a call to me personally, and I hope to other people, that we can do more, we need to do more. Where you had the bit in the book about, we so often pray about, the coming of heaven and revelation, and all will be made right, and we pray to God we get there, and no, I mean, it's to be the heaven coming to earth now, and it's up to us. Jesus wants us to do more. And so it's very simple, but I really felt such a strong pull personally to be a bolder voice for Christ in any way I can, small and large ways. So thank you for the, I think, very well written.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Appreciate that.
It's my understanding in the American Civil War that a lot of the Confederate soldiers marched off to battle believing that God was on their side. So God loved them best. Is there a sense among white Christian nationalists that God loves them best, or God loves America, we're the favorite child?
Yeah, that is a part of the narrative, that America plays a special role in God's plan for the world. And I think the example you bring out is really powerful, that theologians and soldiers on the North and the South were using the Bible and using Scripture to support their view, right? And to go into battle, both were claiming to be on God's side. And so I think that's where it should hopefully impart in us a willingness to sit and hold some humility in the fact that we don't know perfectly, but we have to think really clearly about, well, what does this mean for those around us? Because, again, just quoting the Bible doesn't mean that we're moving in a direction that all of us now would condemn slavery and all those things that the South was fighting for. But it doesn't mean that we don't have blind spots today. So I think being in discussion, being in relationship, listening to those voices of those different than us, hopefully will help us to see where those blind spots are. Because again, it isn't just quoting the Bible that's going to lead us there. We have to be aware of the context that we're in. I think the Civil War is one of those examples that makes it really clear. And so, yeah, I think it's a wonderful example.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's a similar divide as we've seen politically between urban and rural spaces in Christian nationalism, if between urban, suburban, and rural spaces.
Yeah, so we look at this a little bit in the first book, just looking at how much is represented. And so one of the key findings we have is that the spectrum is represented in urban, rural, suburban spaces. Now we look at where it is more likely to be in rural, but especially suburban, and those differences are significant. But when we're looking at particular topics like outcomes, kind of like what I shared, and we control for all those different demographic markers, usually size of place where people are kind of drops out, where gender, education, or politics, religion, those tend to mean more. But when we're just looking at kind of where it's represented, we do see it everywhere, but more in rural and especially suburban spaces. Yeah, great question.
Hi, I haven't read your book, admittedly, but I do look forward to doing so.
No worries.
I gather that a large part of the what drives the book is your story of how you journeyed out of what could be fertile ground for Christian nationalism. In your research, have you found any evidence or any anecdotes about people whose journey went the other way, going from non-fertile ground, and how they were brought into that fertile ground for Christian nationalism?
That's a really good question, and off the top of my head, no kind of anecdotes come to mind. I know that it is something that can happen and does happen. Some folks that talk about it will say it's less taught and more caught, right? And so just being in those contexts, I think, can draw folks in. So I think in that sense, people will become a part of groups or congregations where this, is an organizing framework and others around them believe it. And so those plausibility structures, right, get strong. And so then at some point, it tilts in a direction where, they're going to select in and embrace that. And it can grow stronger or grow less strong. And it can change over individual histories. It can be movement. But nothing comes to mind, but I think it's true, as you're kind of probably alluding to, right? That this is happening and can happen, for sure.
I have not read your book either, but I certainly want to now after hearing your discussion. As Dr. Kelvin pointed out this historically you can draw a kind of an arc across Christian nationalism in many different forms historically. As you look at this historically and you see some decline in the ambassador role, from where we have been, where we are today, and where we are headed, are you optimistic, pessimistic, and if so, why?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I get asked that sometimes. So like another way the question gets phrased is what gives you hope? And I think it can depend on the day and the time of day. It can depend on how I'm feeling in the moment, whether I'm more hopeful and optimistic or less. But I think one way that tends to give me optimism more often is at the individual level, especially among young people, that there's a real reckoning with what they've been handed. And the values and beliefs, as you had shared, I don't know your name, but that we grew up with saying we should value these things, but then looking at when it comes to power or no power, we'll set those values and beliefs aside. And I think young folks have a real sense of that. And so I think that gives me hope. And I think among individuals, I see a lot of that reckoning, whether it's Second or other congregations too. But I think institutions, because of money and power and prestige that's wrapped up in those, I think they're much less likely to do a deep reckoning with some of these issues. And so I think institutions, renewing, I'm less optimistic about. But I think that they're, underneath that, there's a current. And so, as I try to close, the parable of the mustard seed, that we can believe that there are those, and it will grow, and there can be something new. But I'm less optimistic about institutions and more optimistic about at the individual level. So thank you for your question.
Thank you for your presentation this evening. I found it very provocative.
Yeah.
A question I have for you is a kind of a proposal for how to move ahead with the problem of Christian nationalism. And that is, if we try to engage others in this discussion, others than those who maybe are not even Christian, because that is a shrinking number, what do you think of moving forward on the basis of our Constitution's proposal for the relationship between religion and the state, where on the one hand it proposes free exercise of every religion, and that ought to be a problem for Christian nationalism because they're proposing a unique privilege for one vision,
right?
When our Constitution does not set that out at all. And the other one, the other side of that is the disestablishment of religion.
Right.
And that there can be no and ought not to be any theocratic claims for any kind of political life.
Right.
And it seems like to me that would be a productive common ground to engage in this opposition to any kind of what I might call totalizing, totalitarian, utopian presumption about how to impose a view on, at least talking about in America. It seems like our foundation ought to prohibit that, and that it would open up the door for a productive involvement of others who are not Christians to share that, which might share that vision.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. So there are a number of groups that are involved in this that I've worked with. So there's a social movement, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, that the Baptist Joint Committee, sponsors. And it's a commitment to, the disestablishment and free exercise of religion. Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, has folks of all different religious faiths a part of that as well. And so those are two groups that are doing that work. And I think you're exactly right, that as Christians, holding those dear and recognizing that we are a part of a diverse group, right, of people, and that the more we can defend those and the rights of others, then we'll be able to also take part, but not at the detriment to other people. So I totally agree, and I think that is one of those guardrails, too, of democracy that we can, be a part of that work. Thank you.
You've touched on this, but I'm hoping you can speak more to it. how does a community such as a church like this, which your statistics would indicate is at least 50-50 on this issue, how do we relate to each other? If we're just going to ignore this problem, then these idols are going to continue to be worshipped. If we confront this problem, we're looking at a schism. So what advice would you have for Chris?
Yeah.
That's a great last question.
Yeah. Well, I will say in all seriousness that Chris is smarter than me, and if there's a person that's going to figure it out, he'll be the one to lead us there. But I do think your point is well taken, right? In that it is uncomfortable and it is difficult. But a friend of mine who does not hold the same religious beliefs that I do, we talk about how in the midst of holding some different beliefs, we can value the same things. And it's those shared values that allow us to come together and to discuss those differing beliefs. And that's, for me, a Christian talking to somebody outside the faith. But I think it holds true for congregations and, in spaces like Second, where there are going to be people with different beliefs. But what values do we hold in common? What values do we say, we are going to meet around these values, and now let's discuss these differing beliefs? So I think that's one way. And the other is to recognize that we're all on a journey and that nobody has reached an end point, and we're all moving right at different spots, and people are coming into this discussion at different spots. And so I don't claim to have arrived or to have any special dispensation, but the book is me trying to share portions of my journey for wherever folks are, and to not condemn or to uplift anyone, but to say we're on a journey, and recognizing that in others, I think, is really important so we can journey together. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Let's express our appreciation for Andrew. So if you've enjoyed this evening, and I hope you have, I'm happy to say that Andrew will be with us here at Second on 2 more occasions in person at our 9 a.m. Sunday school time on the 12th and the 19th of November in the common room down here on the 2nd floor. And so maybe a little more intimate setting. Well, maybe we'll get this many again, but we'll have a chance to interact with him more on these questions. So mark that on your calendar, November 12th and November 19th. And now I'd like to invite Chris forward to sort of wrap up the evening and give us a little benediction. Chris.
So I want to acknowledge the importance of what happened in the last hour and a half and your participation in that. Spaces like this and times like this are increasingly rare, and the opportunity to really open ourselves to learn, grow, be challenged, and maybe push back, that is good for us. It is good for our church. It is good for us as individuals, and it portends good things for broader community as well. This afternoon, I had the chance to go down to Inglewood Christian Church and the Inglewood Community Development Corporation with Shadrach Kim Wendo, a member of our congregation who is also a member of the board of directors there. And Joe Bowling, who is the executive director of the Inglewood CDC, which has done remarkably transformative work on the Near East Side and continues to do that, gave us a tour of some of the projects that they are leading. And at one point, and Shad, I don't know if you sort of picked up on this, but at one point I just kind of asked him, they in the late 90s, his family and several other families who were members at Inglewood Christian Church made the decision to move back into the neighborhood, very difficult neighborhood to live in on many levels, made the really prophetic decision, we're gonna sort of plant ourselves in this neighborhood and be the hands and feet of Christ in this neighborhood. And I just kind of asked him what was probably a naive and maybe even foolish question. I said, what kind of drove your decision to do that? And he said, probably the most natural thing that came to him, but it struck me for how powerful it was. He said, I guess I figured when you're a disciple, you're all in. I guess I figure when you're a disciple, you're all in. Now, he's a disciple, Christian church, disciples of Christ, so I don't know which kind of disciple he meant. No, I do know what kind of disciple he meant. And so your attendance here tonight, your willingness to engage in this topic is an indication that you are all in. And so I'm just grateful. I'm grateful to be a part of a congregation that can do hard things and have hard conversations. Because again, if that doesn't happen here, I'm not sure where else these kinds of conversations can happen. The one thing that I would say, Tom, maybe slightly in response to your question, is it does take trust and a foundation of relationship. You would never ask someone the worst thing they have ever done in the first conversation you have with them, right? It's like proposing on the first date. You wouldn't do that. So we have to be able to build the kinds of relationships that create containers in which explosive conversations can be held. And so let's commit ourselves to creating those kinds of containers over time by building the kinds of relationships and the kind of trust that enables those kinds of difficult discussions and conversations, because all of us have something to contribute and each of us has something to learn. And the only place, other than the talk about Baylor and we all know who has the best college basketball program in the country. So other than that, the only thing that I would push back on with Andrew, I do have hope in our ability to rebuild institutions, because I get to serve one that I believe is committed to the institutional part of this work. There is great power in the kinds of historic and traditional institutions so long as we allow God to breathe new life into us, and I think God is in the process of doing that. So let us pray. Gracious God, as you've gathered us here, equipped us, challenged us, and we pray inspired us, we ask now that you would send us in the strength of your Spirit, send us in unity with one another, and send us with a passion for your gospel, abundant life for all. In Christ's name, amen. Go in peace.